He uses suffering to strengthen your faith. He uses suffering to bring you to your knees. He uses suffering, for example, to bring you to a fresh new commitment. He brings suffering and trial and hardship to open your heart, to help you understand that you need him in your life. That's just one way. For example, one of the ways of God is he's silent. Sometimes you talk to him, silent. Nothing happens. I can remember at one of the critical moments in my life when I was seeking direction earlier in my life. It was a critical moment. God was absolutely silent. He was so silent to me. I'd read the Bible and I'd say, God, do you see what that says? And I'm sure he didn't get angry. In fact, I remember getting down one night, I had the hymn book, and I'd read some hymns to him and say, God, here's what I've been singing all my life. Where are you? And God is silent. But then what he answered in the most awesome way. I wouldn't even tell you this morning, I don't have time. But I can tell you, one of the ways of God is he's silent. Sometimes he makes us wait. So there are all kinds of ways of God. I preached a whole series on it, but I'm simply saying, the way we grow in faith is we begin to understand his ways. How does he work? Listen, one of the ways he works, he uses the most inopportune situation. He operates in the most unusual ways sometimes, with the most unusual people that you think could never succeed at anything, and God uses them in an awesome way. He wants your faith to grow. That's what advancing is all about. And then, of course, by observing the work in the lives of other people. And I think about how God certainly stimulated my faith to grow by spending 1 week with my grandfather. You've heard me say that before. I listened to him for 1 week. He told me how God had worked in his life. They were etched in my mind. And I remember thinking, well, God, if you worked in his life that way, and my grandfather was a pastor and an evangelist, and then one of the godliest men I've ever known, I thought, God, if you work in his life that way, how do you work in my life? And I began to read the Old Testament characters, and my most favorite ones primarily. And I thought, well, Lord, if you worked in his life that way, then you worked in their life that way. What will you do in my life? If I obey you and trust you, what will you do in my life? My grandfather absolutely catapulted my faith in 1 week. We grow in our faith by watching God work in other people's lives. And then, of course, if I could take one statement and say, if you want to grow your faith, you practice this statement. Obey God, leave all the consequences to him. If you will practice that statement, and I meet people all the time who walk up to me and say, Dr. Stanley, obey God, leave all the consequences to him, to remind me that they heard it and they're listening and they're practicing it. And even small children, their parents have taught them to repeat that. Think about this simple truth. Obey God, leave all the consequences to him. That is faith in perfection. I'm going to do what he says, no matter what it costs, no matter what it requires, and then I'm going to let him work. I'm going to watch him work. I'm going to leave all the consequences to him. Why? Because I believe that God will honor obedience. That's what that's all about. I believe that God not will, but always honors obedience. He never overlooks obedience because obedience honors God. It pleases God. We're trusting God when we obey him. And he says in Hebrews, the chapter we know about faith, that in order to please him, I must believe in him. I must trust him. I must put faith in him. So I would ask you where you are in your own faith. Then, of course, I think about through answered prayer. God certainly builds our faith through answered prayer. Listen, this is why we should teach little children to pray about little insignificant things, but significant to them, listen, very early in life, so that they learn, if they talk to God, whom they know very little about, but as a good parent, you would teach them some things about God through Jesus. If they would do what God says, here's what he'll do. And he answers their prayer. And I can remember both of my kids at times when I understood that, and I realized they knew how to talk to God and how to ask of God and to receive from God. They knew how to trust God. The thing that builds faith is not just praying, but praying with expectation, praying with confidence, praying with boldness, praying with assurance. You say, well, sometimes I'm not sure. You keep praying. God will give you the assurance that you need. It's a matter of trusting him. And you think, for example, what a simple example this is. Here's the little boy standing up on the ladder, and his father says, just jump, Dad'll catch you. Oh, but you may drop me. And he goes through all of that. And then finally, he looks at his dad and jumps right in his arms. He had to get off the ladder to get in his father's arms. You have to get off of your seat in faith and jump in the arms of God and watch what he does in your life. Listen, my goal is God's goal, that you are able to be and become and do and achieve what God has in mind for you. Do not let anybody tell you you can't. You can do anything God has called you to do. Because, listen, the Word of God says you have all of God's power in heaven behind you to enable you to do it. That's what he promised his disciples, and every single one of us is just as important. How could you ever deny God the privilege of sharing his message with somebody? Now, one of the ways we also grow in our faith is by worship.